Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Rushing the Field, National College Football Show from NBC Sports. I'm Nicole Auerbach, and Joshua Perry is somewhere without Wi-Fi, which I didn't even know existed in 2025. So I am joined by Ben Portnoy from the Sports Business Journal to recap SEC Media Days. We'll set the table for Big Ten and ACC, but most importantly, Ben, you are a fellow May wedding enthusiast. We both got married this summer at the perfect time. I felt for the last year that every single person who works in college football or NFL was like, oh, I got married in May. Like everyone has the same anniversaries. Did that experience happen to you as well?
100%. And I think it was like, here's like the 1 week where everyone can kind of get away and, hope that no headlines happen. I don't know about you, but like I kept hoping that the house settlement would happen while I was like on my honeymoon. So I was just like, cool, this is not my problem. And, someone else can deal with it. But, lucky me it happened after that. But, yeah, I feel like every other person in sports media was like, oh, yeah, I got married in May or late April or whatever it was. So I guess we're in good company.
I had the exact same thought about the house settlement. Like it was my running joke. And then, of course, it waited, right, until it was like a Friday news dump in like mid-June, June 11th, something like that. So, yes, but we won't talk about that. We'll talk about more fun things because there's actual football to discuss. SEC Media Days is kind of the unofficial kickoff for this, because it's 4 days. We were in Atlanta. We were at the Omni Hotel at the College Football Hall of Fame together. And we got to see Arch Manning. We got to see a lot of these players who are going to define the 2025 college football season. Got to hear the coaches complain, which also is a part of talking season. And Greg Sankey give a state of the SEC. We'll get to that in a second. But I want to start like biggest picture. What was the biggest storyline? What's the biggest headline coming out of Atlanta to you?
I'll cop out and I'll give you two. I think one is that the SEC is as wide open as it's been in, I'd say a decade. Like, I spent 6 years in this league before I started in this national role. And I think like one of the things that came out of it was there's a lot of different things that sort of a lot of unknowns about the league, I think right now. You've got, really good teams at the top, right? Texas, Georgia, whatever. But like you also have question marks like how good is Arch, right? Like how good is how good is Georgia going to be on offense again this year? Like we'll see. Gunnar Stockton. So I think like there's some questions at the top, and then you look at like teams like South Carolina that kind of fall in that next rung. Alabama, we'll see. So I think that's part of it. I think the other part of it is, we continue to go around and around on this college football playoff debate. Greg Sankey talked a decent amount about it this week, and surely Tony Petitti will get asked about it at Big Ten Media Days this week. So around and around and around we go on the carousel there. But I think those were kind of the two things that stuck out to me the most, at least, sort of off the bat.
It feels like part of that wide open nature, and maybe this is college football as a whole. There's a lot of quarterback turnover at the biggest blue blood programs, right? And even with Arch Manning, which he's already a household name and everyone knows him. He did get a couple starts last year. Like he's not starting from complete scratch. But, when Ohio State and Michigan and Texas and Georgia and Alabama and all of these places are going to be starting relatively unproven quarterbacks, or at least quarterbacks without starting experience, Notre Dame will throw in there as well. It does feel like that. Like we think we know, right? Like the SEC media poll came out and it picked Texas to win the league, followed by Georgia, then Alabama, then LSU, then South Carolina. And that feels right as we sit here in July. And like that felt the way that we talked about those teams in Atlanta, the way that they kind of talked about themselves and where they position themselves. But like you don't know, because it is still a question mark of how that quarterback figures it out. And also like what exactly the pieces are around it, right? And like the portal has giveth and taken away from some of these teams too.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And I think, this is the one thing that I think the portal has done for college football. And I think the SEC is kind of case in point in this. And like, you can plug a lot of holes and you can turn over a roster, but again, like it changes the dynamic and it spreads out the talent, right? Like we think about, it's not that long ago, right? 5-10 years ago, if that Alabama's stacking class on top of class, and that's just what it is, right? And this sort of saving machine rolls on. And, you can say the same thing about Georgia too. But a lot of those guys that, would have spent 2, 3, 4 years before they're playing, like are leaving, going elsewhere. And I think you look at that across the SEC, Arch Manning's kind of an outlier, frankly, in this conversation. And that he's been at Texas for now, I guess what this is going on his third year, right?
Yeah.
So I think, you add those things together and it creates a dynamic where leagues are just a little more wide open. And I think it disperses the talent. And like, look, I get it. Like fans sort of roll their eyes and say like, I can't figure out who's on my team anymore. I get that. Like that's, a complication of all of this. But I do think, again, like at the end of the day, like you look at, recruiting rankings and where guys end up, and especially quarterbacks in particular. Like I know a lot of people have done some reporting around this of like just how much quarterbacks move these days, and like it really does disperse the talent. And I think it's why you see a league like the SEC is wide open as it is, even though, yeah, to your point, like the way it stacks up and the way the media voted for it, I can get behind it. It checks out, but it's still a little bit of an interesting dynamic as far as how, again, like how spread out the talent is and how wide open a league that, has really had a dominant team at the top. And I think if you throw in the Saban effect on top of that, Alabama not being, what it was, or not having Nick Saban and, running the show, I think changes the complexion of the league as well.
It's also really interesting to me that Texas picked to finish first ahead of Georgia. They kind of have a Georgia problem right now. They were favored to beat Georgia both the games last year. They blew a big lead. They had trouble at the end of the game. It reminds me of when Georgia was knocking on the door but couldn't beat Alabama. And like you can't do it until you've done it. And it feels like we're in that position with Texas, with Sark, and Kirby Smart, because like, I don't know if you still feel this way, but for me, it's really hard when you're the gold standard of the SEC and therefore like one of the gold standards in the country in college football. It's hard for me. I mean, again, I voted for Texas ahead of Georgia, but like, do I believe that until I see it? It's really hard to make that decision when someone just kind of does have the machine is humming and everything is rolling. And it feels like when Saban's Alabama and Kirby Smart had to get over that hump. Does Texas do it this year? Like, do they have I mean, they do on paper, right? They have the pieces. They should have the quarterback. But how do you evaluate like where Georgia is and what they're replacing, coming off a year where Carson Beck was wildly inconsistent, but now isn't there anymore?
I think Georgia's a fascinating conversation, right? Because like I think the floor is so dang high at this point with a team like Georgia, where we're kind of like, yeah, like if they go 10-2, we're kind of thinking, oh, what's wrong, right? And it's just it's just the reality of what it is with what it's been under Kirby Smart in the last 5-7 years. And I think like with Georgia, again, like we'll see what Gunnar Stockton is, but again, like this is also a team that won a national championship with Stetson Bennett at quarterback. Like Gunnar Stockton doesn't need to set the world on fire, and was a 5-star recruit coming out of high school for a reason, and a lot of people really wanted him. The folks in Columbia who had him committed for a while at South Carolina were part of that as well. So I think that Texas has the pieces, but again, like this is sort of the this is part of talking season, right? We don't really know anything, but we think we might know something. But I do think like you look at Texas, right? Like they lost a lot of pieces and a lot of experienced pieces from last year's team, and I think like we can't underestimate that. But then you sort of flip it on its head, and it's like, well, they've recruited really well, they've plugged some holes, they've got a guy like Arch Manning who we think is going to be probably one of the 2 or 3 best quarterbacks in the league. Like the pieces are there. It's just to your point. I think it's sort of like it's a little bit of like I'll believe it when I see it, but you look at what Texas has done in the trenches the last few years and what they've done on the defensive and offensive lines in particular, like that looks like a team that can win an SEC championship. And I think like that's the thing that, separates. And I think that you see it in the Big Ten, you see it in the SEC, like these leagues, and it's cliche at this point, but like these teams that compete at the highest levels are the teams that are the best in the trenches. And like, they've got great quarterback play. They've got great receivers. They've got great running back, whatever. But like, it's the trenches that really separate these teams. And I think Texas looks like a team that can win the SEC. But again, to your point, it's kind of like, I'll believe it when I see it as well. Even if I do think it might happen, I'm still a little reticent.
I just think it's there's something to that, right? Until you actually do it for the first time. But you're right. I mean, like this is a team, they've weathered injuries and still been a couple plays away from the national championship game 2 years in a row. I thought that Arch was really impressive, getting to be around him for the first time. He was great on the whole, like, guys, I haven't done it yet. Like, don't anoint me. Don't give me the Heisman. Like, I got to prove it. Rents due every day. Like, everyone was talking about just that demeanor. And one of my favorite moments that I liked, I was talking to Steve Sarkisian for the radio for SiriusXM. So it was nice because you just get actual more time around these guys. And so we were telling him, we're like, yeah, Arch was great. Like really enjoyed him. Got some stories about like how his grandpa Archie was like signing every text with his name as if like the grandchildren didn't have their grandpa saved in their phone, which was like peak grandpa. I loved it so much. So we were just talking to Sark and he was like, yeah, it's really something to be around like the Mannings, like him and his uncles and stuff. Like the wit and the jokes are just like rapid fire. Like you really have to keep up with those guys. And like, you totally get that out of Arch. Like he's right there. Like the little comments, like the brain just works like at a different speed than other people. So I thought that was really cool, but also just great demeanor and great answers for like why he stayed. You mentioned how unusual that is. especially to be a quarterback that highly touted and then sit for 2 years. But then you have the luxury of this, right? Like you're going third year in a system. Arguably the best and most creative offensive play caller is your guy, and you're familiar with him, and you're adding an element of athleticism and speed that they couldn't do with Quinn Ewers because he was always hurt, and maybe also doesn't have the same ability as Arch Manning. But, he was saying like if there were other things that he was looking for, he would have left. But if you like the program, you like the town, the classes, the campus, your friends, there isn't necessarily a reason to leave. But how many times have we heard that with quarterback? Like they always go, they want playing time, they want to start. But you have him and you have Garrett Nussmeier at LSU that I think we should celebrate this season because they did stay, because they waited their turn. Like it kind of feels like a throwback. Like we asked Sark about that and like how unusual it is in today's day and age. And he's like, it is for you guys, but not for me because of where I've coached in the past. Like at USC, you just waited your turn and then you became like a Heisman finalist, right? Like, and you went off to the NFL. But it does feel really unusual for 2025.
It does. I mean, or look at a place like, not that recent past, right? Like Lincoln Riley just cycled through quarterbacks year over year, but it was guys who were there for a year or two or so on and so forth before they jumped into the Heisman conversation. And so I think you're right. I do think the thing that's interesting with Arch is, and I think, you're right. Like, I think he showed a lot of maturity. I thought the presence on, at media days was great, all of that. But I think the thing that I find fascinating is like, Quinn Ewers, like obviously sort of, I don't want to say hit his ceiling, like that's probably unfair and obviously dealt with injuries and things like that. But like the thing that I keep coming back to, and it's a super surface level like examination of it, but it's like, if they felt like Arch was going to give them a better opportunity to win football games, like Arch is probably playing last year at this point. And I think like there's an interesting conversation of like, yes, it's, certainly Quinn's a guy that was a huge recruit, has done a ton and all of that. And like, it's a complicated situation, not to oversimplify it. But I do think like, again, like we get to the point of, what is Arch going to be when he plays this year? And like, at that point, like, was he maybe not ready? And I think like, I know there was a lot of calls of like, oh, Arch should be playing now. And is Quinn, should Quinn be sidelined? Whatever, all of that, right? Like that's a huge discourse and certainly a complicated discourse in a place, with as loud of a megaphone as Austin, Texas. But I do think like it leads me to not necessarily think that like Arch isn't going to be great. Like I think he's going to be a great quarterback, but I do think it sort of leaves open those questions, right? Of like, hey, like, man, if you thought Arch was going to be the quarterback to lead you to a national championship, you probably would have stuck him in the game a few more times a year ago, right? And especially with how good that team was. And I think it creates an interesting dynamic of like, well, a little bit of the wait and see. But I think you're right. Like, I think that he's done everything to be in a position that Texas is going to be really good, probably, right? Like, put a floor on it. Like, I don't think Texas is probably finishing worse than like fourth in the SEC this year, just because of what that roster is. Like, I think it's constructed really well around him. He's obviously a super talented kid, like really impressive kid, all the above. Right. But I do think it becomes this waiting game of like, yeah, well, we'll see. Like, he should be really good, but we don't really know. So I think it makes for a really fun dynamic. And again, like makes for a really fun dynamic in a place that like we think could, be the best team in the league, but, has a fair question mark at a few spots.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think the floor is certainly making the CFP and the ceiling is a national championship. And that's like a good place to be in, but also a really hard place to be in for these programs. I want to get your thoughts on Alabama. We mentioned them a little bit, but mostly in the context of like Saban programs reloading, a kind of a slightly different era of college football, where guys did go to just wait, maybe redshirt even at Alabama, because you're going to be developed to go to the NFL, probably play in the CFP in the 4-team era. And so I'm curious where you think they are right now and like exactly how uncomfortable life is for Kalen DeBoer, because it was a drop off from what we're expecting for Alabama. We've spent the offseason somehow at times relitigating whether or not they should have been the CFP. No, the committee made the right decision. That team was flawed and they had some really, really bad losses. So we talked about how kind of like Tuscaloosa was unprepared for those types of losses. Like it's been so long, even just since they lost that many games in the regular season. So I guess just kind of set the table for me about what the state of Alabama going into this season, Kalen DeBoer year 2, what do we expect? And just like, how does that fan base feel after, their first year in the post Saban world?
Yeah, I mean, start with last year, right? Like, I think you're right. Like, I don't think the playoff discourse is really wrong. Like, Alabama should not have been in the playoff. Like, I just think it's
Ben,
pretty.
Sorry, where did you go to college again?
That's right, Indiana.
Okay, just
The
checking.
graduate of a team that should have been in the playoff. But no, I mean, look, like if you're Alabama, like it's pretty simple. And I'd said this a lot about Ole Miss last year. I think it was the Florida loss, right?
Yep.
Or was it Kentucky? Yeah, Florida. I'm mixing up my Florida and Kentucky losses for Ole Miss over the last couple of years. But and same thing with South Carolina with a couple of games. Like if you're Alabama, like don't lose to the worst Oklahoma team in a decade. Like it's just it's things like that. So you start there, and then you move forward and you look at what this season is. One, I don't think the sky's falling in the way that I think some folks in Tuscaloosa might feel. And I get it. Like this is a crazy dynamic and a crazy consistency for a program for, 15, 20 years at this point with Saban, being in the mix for a national championship every year. First of all, like that's not normal, right? Like there's a reason he's one of the three best, if not the best coach in the country forever, basically, and one of the best coaches in the history of college football. But I think, look, Alabama's still super talented. Like, they've recruited well. They've signed some guys that I think are going to make a difference. Like, we'll see what happens at quarterback. Like, Jalen Milroe, I think was really good in spurts and was really not great in spurts. And so if they get a little more consistency at the quarterback position, do you end up winning, 10, 11 games instead of 9? Like, yeah, that's probably fair. But again, I don't see the world falling in the way that I think some people do in Tuscaloosa. Like, yes, if Alabama goes 9-3 again, which is crazy to say, like Alabama could go 9-3 in back-to-back years and they might be on the verge of firing a coach. But look, Kalen DeBoer is a really good football coach. And I think I think it's, again, it's kind of the cliche of you never want to be the guy following the guy. And I think it's an impossible situation for whoever inherited this job. But I think, look, Kalen DeBoer built a national championship caliber team at Washington, which is a place that has tons of history and is a really good football program, but in this day and age is a harder place to do that, right, than a place like Alabama. And so you add those things together and you look at it and say hey, it's going to take a year. You have to sort of reset what this looks like. And again, I think if you're a coach and you're again walking into the situation that he did, yeah, there's things that were amazing about Saban, but you can't also just sort of cosplay Nick Saban at the same time, right? You've got to do the things that you feel fit right for your program. And you look at how Alabama's recruiting over the last month. They've obviously picked up some serious big time recruits in the 2026 class. Now, obviously that doesn't help for this year, but I think things have started to turn in the right direction. They've started to get things under, not necessarily under control, but moving in the right direction on the NIL front and moving in that direction. And I think you add those things together and they're going to put together a competitive roster. Now, what does that mean for this year? I don't know. But again, I think it's a little, I think it's really easy to get around the thing of yeah, it's hot seat season. Let's fire everyone and see who Alabama wants to hire. Right. But I do think that, you look at what Alabama was a year ago and it's obviously a tricky situation where you're sort of in a transition year, no matter what that was going to look like. And I think if Alabama finishes in the top, 5 in the SEC, that feels like a pretty good spot. If they end up 9-3 again, I get it. People in Tuscaloosa aren't going to be happy, but I do think that still sort of gives you a building block. And I know that sounds crazy to, again, feel people need to fire a coach after going 9-3 in back-to-back years. But again, the standard's a little bit different at Alabama, and right or wrong, I think it creates a really fun storyline for the rest of the year.
It does. And just one other thing that I think is going to potentially be a big difference this year is Ryan Grubb back reunited as well with Kalen DeBoer. So that offense and the way, if you think about what we enjoyed so much about Michael Penix Jr. and that Washington team, it was the offense. It was the way that they moved the ball down the field. And that is a lot Ryan Grubb. So I'm fascinated by that. I think it's going to be really, really interesting. A 5th place finish in the SEC will be the world is ending in Tuscaloosa, even though that is right about where the cutoff point is for the CFP. We saw that 9-3 in the regular season was right on the bubble for the CFP in year 1 of the 12-team era. Was there any team that maybe you went into the weekend or week in Atlanta feeling a certain way and came out feeling differently, good or bad? Anyone surprise you just in the way, the vibes you were getting, or just things that they were saying about how they feel about where they are?
I think there's 2. I think one, Ole Miss is one that I just can't get a read on. And I think I know a lot of people are really high on Ole Miss, and I think Lane Kiffin deserves the benefit of the doubt on some level, given what he's done in Oxford. But Ole Miss is replacing a lot from last year's team. And if you look and you talk to people in Oxford, they're high on, what they're going to be able to do at quarterback and everything else. But I mean, that on paper was the best Ole Miss team that they've had in 30 years. And they lost most of that roster, most of the big pieces, I should say. And so again, I don't doubt Lane Kiffin's ability to bring in talent, but that leaves me a little bit, skeptical that they're going to be as good as they been the last couple of years. And again, like even coming out of media days, Austin Simmons, I think is going to be a really good fit and good quarterback and all that. But I'm a little hesitant to say, hey, yeah, Ole Miss is going to be in the playoff conversation again this year. Like if you told me Ole Miss goes 8-4, that feels more right, maybe. The other one is South Carolina. Like I think there's a lot of people who are really high on South Carolina, and someone who lives in Columbia, South Carolina, and covered South Carolina for almost 3 years. Like I think, look, this team is really, really good, and I love Shane Beamer. I think he's done an amazing job, but I just think like when you look at the history of South Carolina, it's hard to say like, yeah, they're going to go win the SEC. I have a hard time. And it's not even really a product of what South Carolina is this year. It's really a product of how tough their schedule is. Like you look at who they've got, and it's really tough. Like you got Oklahoma last year, and I think Oklahoma low-key maybe end up being one of the better teams in the league this year. Like I'm way higher on Oklahoma than I think most people. I think, you've got LSU, you've got Alabama, like you've got Ole Miss, like you're going to play Clemson, who I think, may end up being one of the 3 best teams in the country this year. Like I think Clemson's due for a rebound. And so, again, is South Carolina in a position to like beat some people who are really, really good? Yeah. Like I think South Carolina's gonna be really, really good. I think Lenore Sellers is a really good quarterback. I think that offensively, they're going to be a lot better at receiver than they were a year ago, but they also probably take a half step back at defense just because they graduated so many guys. So it's like, where does kind of water find its level a little bit there? But with the schedule and what they've got there, like I have a really hard time saying like, yeah, South Carolina's going to go win 10, 11 games. Like if you told me they end up 9-3 again, like in that conversation, I can buy that. But I think, those are kind of the two where it's like, I think a lot of people are really quick to pencil in South Carolina. It's not necessarily that I'm skeptical. Like I think they're going to be really good. I think that schedule makes me take a brief pause and say like, yeah, if they end up somewhere in the like 7 to 9 range, it's more a product of their schedule than it is like South Carolina not being good.
The way that I've been talking about them is if Lenore Sellers is in the Heisman race, then they're doing all the things that they want to do, right? Because that means that the offense is carrying the team, that he's able to carry the offense. Like that means that they're winning enough of those games. And I think that that's how I feel about them. I think it's hard, to take a step forward from what they did last year, right? Like the types of wins they had, how close they were against some of those other games. Like obviously that's what it is, right? More early season success than they've had under Shane Beamer, and finishing games. There were a couple fluky moments as well, but like those are kind of the differences, and those are hard gaps to close. But I'm with you on kind of just the questions about the schedule, and with you on Clemson. I mean, I think they are going to start the preseason in the top 3. I think it's some combination of Texas, Penn State, and Clemson are like the teams I think everyone feels the best about. But yeah, South Carolina, certainly an interesting team. We haven't really hit on LSU, but that's another team in that same category, right? Like these are the top 5 teams in the preseason poll. Brian Kelly, I thought was really interesting at SEC Media Days, because he basically straight up said like Jaden Daniels and that offense was good enough to win a national championship. Defense was not. That's on me. Now we're there. Like we paid up on the defensive coordinator front. But also he said now they have a defense that is of the caliber to win a national championship. So it's interesting to me because like I think it's not like there's extra pressure for LSU, because I think Brian Kelly already feels that and is already a very tightly wound person. But the acknowledgement of all of that and just sort of like the reality and the pressures of a place where the 3 previous head coaches won national championships is really interesting to me. Plus having one of the best quarterbacks in the country, one of the most experienced guys in the SEC, they're just really interesting. They also have this streak of not winning season openers. Like there's a lot going on there that I think we're always fascinated by what's going on in Baton Rouge, but certainly with Brian Kelly and going there and basically saying like, I took this job to win a national championship, and then not being in the playoff, and Notre Dame getting all the way to the championship game last year. There's just so many different dynamics and like added elements around the LSU program that make them really fascinating. But like, I'm really excited to watch Garrett Nussmeier. I'm interested to see the strides that the defense takes. But if all of this works, like if they hit on all their transfers, if they hit on all of this, they could win the SEC.
100%. No, I agree. And I think objectively, like I would say that Brian Kelly is probably a better coach than 2 of those 3 coaches that won national championships at LSU, like than Les Miles and Ed Orgeron. And like, some people might disagree with me, but like Brian Kelly is probably one of the best coaches in the last 20 years in college football. And like, say what you will about him at Notre Dame, but like this is a really good football coach and a team that I think, to your point, right, like has reloaded on defense. Like you're going to get a fully healthy Harold Perkins. Like what does that look like?
And also, where is he playing? Right, like
where is he playing? I don't know. We'll see. It seems like he's going to play all 11 positions at this rate, so why not, right? And so I think like LSU, in a weird way, like we were kind of talking about, this at the top with Arch and sticking around, like LSU has the makeup of a little bit of a team that feels like a little bit of like 8 years ago, right? Like they're old on the offensive line. They do have to replace Will Campbell, which is obviously a chore, but like they've got Garris Nussmeier, who's an older quarterback. You've got a guy on defense and Harold Perkins, who's been there for feels like 14 years now, but like, it has been there a long while and is, should be one of the best defensive players in America. Like they're older at some of the important positions. And I think like, that goes a long way when you're trying to compete in a league like the SEC. And again, to one that's like kind of wide open on some level, like a place like Texas, where they're, again, like in a way, like not that different from Ole Miss, where you're replacing some big pieces at big positions. Like same thing at Alabama and elsewhere. So I think like LSU has the makeup of a team that like I feel like can not even punch above its weight. Like LSU feels like a team that should be in the mix for the SEC title game this year. And like, I do think that, yes, if LSU misses the playoff this year, there's going to be some real conversations probably about Brian Kelly and what does this look like moving forward and the investments that they've made. But, LSU is another one that has made the investments off the field. They've set up their front office in a way that I think is going to be, helpful in the future, both this year and moving forward. And so I think the pieces are in place, and it's like, in a way, it's sort of like if to put it in a different context, but it's like the Big 12 conversation around Texas Tech, right? Where like Texas Tech has spent all this money and they've put everyone in the positions to do all these things. Like now go win football games. Like LSU's sort of in the same spot, albeit, maybe not with $50 million rosters and things like that and an oil baron bankrolling everything, but like similar sentiment, right? It's like LSU has done the things to put Brian Kelly in a position to win games, and now they need to go win football games. And you've got a junior, senior quarterback that's going to be in a position to do that. You've got a really good defense, I think. Like all signs point to LSU being good this year. It's just a matter of, actually doing it.
Well, it's kind of like you just are eliminating excuses and like reasons for why you haven't achieved something, which is I've been trying to train myself. That's how I want to talk about USC as well, right? Like if you're checking off boxes, so then you get to the point where okay, you have everything that you need, right? Like now go actually win the games. And I'm with you. LSU is in that place. And I think when you talk about if they miss the playoff, that means you're not a top 4 team in the SEC, which also is not acceptable, right? So like they do go hand in hand of sort of like where that cutoff point is for the SEC, which will be regularly again in that 4 or 5, maybe 6 team range in the current playoff model. Before we get to the playoff conversation and what Greg Sankey said, I just wanted you wrote a really interesting piece about kind of like what is unique about the SEC and the SEC media days. And it's the Radio Row of it all. I know they renamed it Digital Drive, which I actually love. And I hope that the CFP uses that because they have for like digital shows and podcasts and radio. But like, I feel like Feinbaum is such a essential piece of this, right? About like the conversation around the SEC. You live in one of the SEC college towns. So like, what is it about that and the way that sports talk radio impacts the SEC that leans into it just means more, like the way that we talk about football in the South?
No, it's interesting. And like, look, like it's funny. Like I come from a Big Ten family. My parents are Michigan grads. I went to Indiana. Like I'm a Big Ten person on some level, but like, professionally, like working in the SEC for 5, going on 5 years as before this job, like it's a different animal in the sense of like the way that people talk about college football in the SEC, the way it is omnipresent 365 days a year is just different. And I think like it's, people make fun of the like, oh, it just means more and this thing and that thing and the Feinbaumization of it all. But like, there's something to that. And I think like, people kind of know about Radio Row at the Super Bowl and that it's this whole thing. Like SEC Media Days kind of has its own version of that. And like, the general public probably isn't aware of that, but like, it's sort of this like physical manifestation of all of this, like in one place, like you're just like watching it in real time. And so I think like, you look at the microphone that the SEC has with whatever SEC Network, with Feinbaum, whoever else. And like, I think there's a reason why people talk about the SEC the way they do is because people talk about it 365 days a year. Like it determines their like, sense of like mental well-being, basically. Like, it's just crazy. Like people are so invested and it's not, and I get it. Like some people would see that and say that's a bad thing, but I do think like there's something to that, right? Like, no matter who you cover or write about or talk about, like you want people to care. And like people in the SEC care like 100 times over. And I think like when you look at Radio Row, you look at the way sports talk is so sort of like a piece of what the SEC is. I think it's really fascinating. And I think it, and talking to some of the folks who've been around Radio Row, Feinbaum, and some of his other, folks who've been around that for, 10, 20, 25 years or more. One of the things that stands out is like, this is, I mean, it's really important and people will listen, year round. But I think it's also too, like, you're in markets where there's not professional sports for the most part. And so like college football is that, right? Like there's a reason that sports talk radio thrives in like Philadelphia and Chicago and New York, because people want to talk about the Bears or the Yankees or whatever, right? Or the Eagles all year round. Well, like the same thing's true in Alabama and Tuscaloosa about Alabama football. Like that's sort of the equivalent. And so I think like you add all those things together and you talk about and you see sort of like the reason that people get so into this. And it's just, again, like I think Radio Row is such a fascinating dynamic, and like it was really fun to write about because I just think like, walking around, I'm kind of like, it feels like the alarm bells are going off in my head of like, oh yeah, like this is literally why everyone cares so much, and you're like seeing it in real time, and I think it's an interesting dynamic just to see play out.
Yeah, it's funny because you mentioned Alabama. I remember like it took a while for those stations to get used to like, oh, we're good at basketball as well. So we need to talk about this in February and March and not just spring football. But that is a very real dynamic. Now, we've talked a lot about goals for these teams, ceilings, floors. Everyone wants to be part of the 12-team playoff. That is what it's going to look like this year. They fixed the seeding, so it's going to be 1 through 12, but 5 conference champions, 7 at-large spots. Yet the entire summer, we've been having this conversation, this debate about should it expand, and if so, how should it look? We heard from Greg Sankey, who said similar things at SEC spring meetings, but the idea that like, okay, yeah, like we, the SEC is now throwing its weight behind this 5 plus 11 at large spot model. The coaches feel strongly about that. So for as much as the Big Ten, the administrators thought the SEC was like in lockstep or moving in that direction, they're not, right? The Big Ten is still staying in its stance of this 4 automatic qualifiers for the Big Ten, 4 for the SEC, 2 for the ACC and the Big 12, 1 for the group of 5, group of 6 champion, and then at large spots after that. So they're on different sides. They're at an impasse on this because they have to agree. Those 2 leagues for sure have to agree if they're going to change this. I've been told on both sides, okay, then maybe we'll just stay at 12, right? If we don't agree on a different model for 14 or 16, 12 works, right? And we've only had it for 1 year. Maybe we just live in that for a little bit longer. Now we'll hear from Tony Petitti in the Big Ten next week or this week, as you're listening to this, in Las Vegas. He hasn't spoken a lot about this on the record, but Greg Sankey seemed very much fine with staying at 12. That was like one of my main takeaways coming out of this. And that he had a couple different jabs at Brett Yormark, the Big 12 commissioner, who made a couple of points like I'm doubling down on my support for the 5 plus 11 model, and some of the other like ways that he talked about the expansion conversation the previous week. Greg Sankey made a gambling reference and said that like he thinks he has the best hand, which yes, if you're the SEC or the Big Ten, you do have a better hand than the Big 12. But ultimately, I think my takeaway was him just underscoring we might stay at 12, and that's fine because that will work just fine for the SEC. What else did you make of Greg's comments, and did you have that takeaway as well about 12?
Yeah, no, I think like, talking to people on all sides of this, like I get the sense that like if this doesn't go to a 5 plus 11, which is I think where, generally speaking, the SEC, the ACC and the Big 12 would like to see it, this thing's probably staying at 12. And I have a hard time seeing the automatic qualifier thing go through. And, I sat down with Greg Sankey during media days, and one of the things he said was like, yeah, like I've been really vocal about this, and I'll say it again, like we don't like automatic qualifiers. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but that's essentially was the sentiment, is like, we're not down for that. And I think like, you hear it about that. I think one thing that's important to note is, and in talking to people around this is like, I think there's concern from ESPN on some level of like, what does this look like, right? As far as, and sort of the terminology that I hear a lot is like, we want this to be a tournament, not an invitational. And I think those are it's subtle, but those are 2 very different things, right? And I think like when you add in the automatic qualifier piece of this, like it sort of scripts this a little bit in a way that I think a lot of people in college sports are not thrilled about, and on the TV side. And I think, again, to your point, like, does this stay at 12? Like, look, I think most people will agree the 12-team format was great. Like, it led to a great couple of months of football. It was really fun. It was really exciting. You know, I do laugh now, though, like thinking back, you know, this is probably about 12 months ago now. Someone said to me that, I think it was an athletic director said to me, they're like, yeah, like this will be great. You know, now that 12 teams are in, you know, we won't have the conversations like we had with Florida State and Alabama, you know, with the 14 playoff. It was like, yeah, well, like we picked 68, 72 teams for the NCAA tournament, and people are still pissed off about it. So like that's not going to change whether we go from 12 to 16 to 4, whatever. But I do think, like, again, like functionally, like the 12-team playoff worked. And if we go to straight seeding, like I think that fixes some of the quirks that people had with it. And I think, like, again, like I don't see the SEC necessarily budging on that, but I think it's also important to note, like, a lot of these things are super interconnected. So like start with the house settlement, right? Like, schools need more money, and that's at a base level, right? Like, schools need more money to fund their rosters. That's sort of point one. Point two is like, okay, this conversation about, will the SEC go to 9 conference games? Will they stay at 8? Well, the Big Ten would love to see them go to 9, because if they go to 9, maybe they'll be more willing to do the automatic qualifier thing, go for the 5 for 11 thing. Well, you know, the SEC doesn't want to go for more night games unless ESPN wants to pay them more for those games, because they're not just going to give away free inventory, right? Like, whenever 16 teams, you add an extra conference game, you're talking about 8 extra games. Like, the SEC is not just going to like hand over ESPN, here's free games, take them, do with them what you will, right? Like, again, people need money, and that would help, you know, help that situation. And so again, then you get back to the automatic qualifier versus the 5+11 and things like that. And like, the Big Ten probably feels like they don't want to support the 5+11 unless the SEC is playing the same number of conference games as they are. So
you like, again, you kind of talk in a circle with this stuff.
Yeah,
that's how I've been saying. So it's like, well, someone would have to make a decision first, or like they would have to make these decisions together and both budge. And I just don't know if that's going to happen.
No. And I think like that's why this is so fascinating, is like these things are all super interconnected. And I know it feels like they're sort of like 3 different conversations, but like I said this the other day, and I think it's true. It's like, these are like all like, they're all like 6 different sides of the same coin. And it's just like, it just, again, you're right, is that like people are going to have to agree. And like, if there's anything we've learned from politics and college football, people don't tend to agree on these things. And so I think it creates an impasse. And so I think it leaves this conversation in a really interesting place. And frankly, like, if it stays at 12, I think most people are okay with that. And I think it creates it's a good product. It's a fun product. And like the last thing I'd say is too, you know, I asked Greg Sankey about this point blank, was like, do you think that having this conversation every single off season like diminishes the product on some level of like, people can't get their minds around what this thing is supposed to look like? Essentially, like, if you're talking about changing the format and all of that. And, you know, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but essentially he was sort of like yes and no, right? And that the BCS, they tinkered with the formula every off season to sort of perfect it and make it better and things like that. So that's one thing. But he said at the same time, and he used the example of like, you know, it's good to have your notes in a book and have it on the shelf and refer to it from time to time, but you don't want to like burn your notes every off season and like start from scratch. And I think like sentiment being is like, yeah, like people are still going to watch college football. People are still going to watch the college football playoff. But I think does that create an issue for fans and like the way they understand this thing, having this conversation every offseason of like, oh, we're going to expand it, but no, we're not actually going to expand it. But yeah, we might expand it. And I think there's something to that.
I agree. I don't think it's great for fans. I think it led to some of the confusion around how the format was going to work last year, because you had it set up and then still debating what it could change to. And at the same time, you had the Pac-12 trying to like, they lost that AQ spot. So that part got confusing. So I wasn't surprised that there were so many issues around seating and all of that, because again, the conversation was already about expanding it. So we didn't spend enough time being like, here's how it's actually going to work. And I think I think understanding the playoff system and how you make it and what you're incentivized to do is a healthy part of a sport. So I think that would be good. I also think it would be healthier for all of us to not trek around to CFP meetings and stand outside and then say like, we had a healthy conversation, but no decisions were made. Like that's also not really productive for anyone. But we are going to hear from the other commissioners, at least 2 more, because we have ACC and we have ACC and Big Ten media days this week. They're the last 2 of the Power 4. So we'll hear from Jim Phillips. We'll hear from Tony Petitti on where they stand on this. So let's take the CFP argument out of topics that we're interested in. I want, just kind of the big picture, like what you're most interested in hearing about at both of these. Let's start with the Big Ten. What big picture, what are you most interested in?
I mean, look, like I think Tony Petitti, like to his credit and his league's credit, like they've got a little bit of an ability to flex this week, right? Like they've won the last 2 national championships. You know, Ohio State's going to be the defending champ. Like the Big Ten's in a really good spot. And I think like, you know, despite what we just talked about 10 minutes ago and the SEC dominating headlines all the time, like the Big Ten's in a really is in a really strong spot and like has been the better league for the last 2 years. And I think like there's something to that. I'll be curious if, you know, Tony Petitti speaks to that, but I do think there is something to that and creates an interesting conversation around this because like, look, the SEC has dominated this sport for so long, but you know, I was looking at it the other day and like, you know, we always hear about the streak of SEC teams winning it, but like, I think the SEC's won 6 out of the last 11. Which like seems like a lot and is like it's more than 50%. But like, I mean, there was a point in time when the SEC had won like the last 10 national championships. So I think like, not to say that the SEC is falling apart or anything like that, to be very clear, but I do think like to the parity conversation we were having earlier, like other schools are really good at football too these days. And I think like it's creating an interesting product. And I think like, you know, the Big Ten's obviously leaning into it. And I think that becomes an interesting talking point next week.
Yeah, and they're more top heavy for sure. Like they're working on trying to get the middle stronger, but it's so funny because as you're mentioning that, just tying it back to the radio conversation, every time I go on Paul Feinbaum, one of his favorite questions to ask me is, Nicole, you know, you live in Big Ten country, you're a Big Ten person, like, you know, down here, like everyone can't believe there's no SEC team in the national championship again. What happens if it happens again for a third time? You know, like he loves to talk about that because there is such an uncomfortability, I think, in the SEC world about not having even a participant in the title game these last 2 years. ACC country is going to be a little bit different, but we talked about this earlier in the show. I mean, Clemson is going to be one of the best teams in the country. I think people feel really, really good about them. Florida State coming off a historic drop-off last year. Bill Belichick at North Carolina. Like there's a lot of interesting storylines for ACC Media Days, certainly before the season starts. What's number one to you? And I mean, maybe I just stole it, but I mean, those are my most interesting stories.
No, I mean, I think you hit the big points. Like Belichick is going to be an obviously interesting conversation. Like knowing what we know about how much Bill Belichick hates press conferences, surely it's going to be a lot of really compelling conversation next week in Charlotte. But I think that's an interesting conversation. I mean, look, like Florida State, like becomes an interesting conversation too. Clemson as well. SMU's bringing back their quarterback and a lot of the pieces that they had from a playoff team that I think, you know, was clearly a really good team, and say what you will about Penn State beating them, but like I think was still like a very capable and good football program last year and should be again. And then I think, look, too, like one thing that's really interesting is like this is the first time in about probably 2 years now that the ACC hasn't had like an existential crisis over its head in a different way, right? Like the last year it was the Florida State and Clemson lawsuits. The year before it's, you know, some of the expansion stuff. And this is sort of like the cleanest off season, I guess, for lack of a better term, that the ACC's had in a little while. And I think there's something to that. And look, like, I think there's a little bit, I think a lot of folks in college sports will tell you like there's a ticking time bomb here a little bit of, you know, the grant of rights for the ACC. I think technically folks can leave after 2030, 2031. So we're only a few years out from that. But I do think like in the interim, things are pretty good and rosy, all things considering how they've been. And so I think it'll be interesting to talk to Jim Phillips of like, hey, okay, you've done all these things, like, now what? Because clearly, like, again, like I think there's an expiration date on some of this stuff, but I do think that again, like there's not necessarily quite the same looming crisis or crises over the league in the same way that it has been the last couple off seasons. And I think that like creates, frankly, like a more positive environment for everyone to talk about and be in as well.
Yeah, when your two biggest brands aren't in active litigation against you, I think that is a win and a positive. I would also even throw in 2 off seasons ago, Florida State getting left out as an undefeated ACC champion. That was also an existential crisis for this conference. And then last year you get SMU in, right? Like, yes, people were arguing about Indiana and SMU still, I guess, for months after the playoff decided that. But yeah, you are in a different place. And so I'm very interested in all of that too, even if it is basically like a 5-year kumbaya period in the ACC before maybe there's more movement or reorganization of college sports. But it's going to be really fun. It's fun to actually talk about football as well and contenders in all of these leagues, to see if Bill Belichick's girlfriend comes to ACC Media Days, to see, you know, how Indiana handles coming off the best season in program history, Penn State, all the pressure that they're facing. as one of the favorites to win a national championship. Still so much more to come. We'll have it covered. Joshua and I will have interviews that will come on this feed, and we'll come back and recap Big Ten at least, and we'll keep tabs on Ben and company over in Charlotte at the ACC. So don't go anywhere. But Ben, I really appreciate you coming on. It's a great conversation, and hope to have you on again at some point this season.
Yeah, always fun. Thanks for having me. This is great.
All right. It's Ben Portnoy from the Sports Business Journal. You can go follow, read his work, subscribe for it as well. And that'll do it for Rushing the Field. I'm Nicole Auerbach. Joshua and I will be back. Like I said, more exclusive content coming your way. So don't go anywhere. Season's approaching.